Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another lecture in the Lubalin lecture series here at Cooper Union. My name is Alexander. I am very excited to welcome you to today's lecture. This lecture series is part of Cooper Union and put together by Cooper and the Lubalin Study Center. The lecture series has been a consistent part of the program, the Cooper program, since the program launched back in 2010. So it's been a series that we've had for quite a while now, and it's a really nice way to create and continue to build and foster design community within the typeface design and kind of adjacent themes. So for those who are not familiar, Cooper is a predominantly certificate program in typeface design, but has quite a few modules and workshops that are focused on type design, but also calligraphy, lettering, coding, and kind of the broader spectrum of material that connects to typefaces and letter forms. I will be posting links in the chat, so keep an eye on for some of these in the chat, and there's no easy way to save links in the chat, so just click through the links and have them open in the browser windows. And I also want to acknowledge and thank TypeCulture for their sponsorship of this lecture series. TypeCulture is an independent digital tape foundry, but also an incredibly wonderful and rich academic resource run by Mark Jammer. I will post the link to TypeCulture. If you guys are not familiar, please check out what Mark does. I also wanted to flag that we had one previous lecture a few Mondays ago, and that's already available digitally. You can watch that in our archives. So Chris Gillern gave a talk called Leaves and Branches about designing for the Cherokee syllabary. It's a really great lecture that's as I said, is available online already in several places. You can find them by going to the Vimeo website, where a lot of the lectures are in HD, vimeo.com/CooperType, and you can sort through, find stuff. You can also go to the Type Cooper website. Under the lecture tab, we have all the past lectures listed there, and when you click on the individual lecture, the recording is embedded into that page. So those are the two easiest ways you can find that. I'm going to post the links for to make it easier to find those things. I'll also mention a couple of very quick housekeeping notes just in terms of chat. Zoom webinar chat is divided into messaging everyone, including everyone who's working behind the scenes and everyone watching. So if you want to send a message to essentially the public attending, you should just make sure to toggle in the to field in the chat window. It should say everyone. If you switch that, if you click on the everyone, it should give you a second option, which is host and panels, which is mostly just folks behind the scenes. So if there's a technical issue that you see, something you want to flag, send a message through that. But otherwise, I would say you probably are looking to select everyone. By default, it doesn't always select that. So it's one. And then you might notice that there's in the top right corner of your Zoom window, there's a YouTube link. We are broadcasting to YouTube. If you wanted to catch a very quick recording of this lecture right as it's happening, you could just click the YouTube link and then open that up in your browser, and then you can save that window or kind of keep that window open if you want it to return. If you have to leave early, that's the easiest, fastest way to get the recording of this lecture. But we will be posting an edited version of this lecture on Vimeo within a week or so. I also wanted to mention a couple of lectures that we have coming up. We have on Monday, November 25th, At the same time, also here in Zoom webinar, lecture called Tuscan, Some Intriguing Questions Over the Singular Ornamental Type Style. The lecture will be presented by Alejandro Lo Celso. It's a really a pretty interesting, comprehensive, as comprehensive as you can do in a lecture format, a look at the style, the Tuscan letter form style. So don't miss that lecture. And then the final lecture closing out the fall series of lectures will be a talk by Dan Reynolds called Dusting Off Black Letter Type. It'll be an overview of formal and historical evolution of black letter typefaces across the globe and across centuries. So very nice peek, a closer peek at a style that is familiar from, feels familiar to a lot of us, but maybe a richer history around that would be intriguing for a lot of you. You can register for that. If you haven't, you can find that information on, of course, the same place where the videos are embedded, coopertype.org. You can just save that QR code and visit that. So that's mostly it for the housekeeping notes. So don't miss those 2 lectures that are coming up in the next few weeks. It'll be the same time, also Mondays, kind of in this 12:30 time slot in the US. Daylight savings times has just come through, so make sure you adjust the times if you're not outside of the US. But I would love to switch over to our main presentation and introduce our speaker. I got to know Eric through his writing, and these are the publications that kind of opened up my eyes to the really expansive range of stencils, the typography papers publication that University of Reading and Hyphen were putting out. So I got to uh, uh, um, meet essentially Eric and got to know his writing around this topic. And I think his biography, his written biography, very succinctly captures a lot of what will basically become a very good introduction to this lecture. So I'll read his biography and I'll welcome him to the stage. Eric is a professor of graphic communication at the University of Reading. For 25 years, he has been investigating the use of stencils for lettering, text composition, and other graphic mark making. The research, some of it done with expert collaborators, has resulted in published studies, exhibitions, reconstructed stenciling equipment, and a working collection of historical artifacts and documents. His aim has been to establish a reliable account of stencil work across time, place, and context, bringing together individual episodes to eventually construct a synoptic history, or at least the framework of one. And I think this is a great lecture to further that process. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Eric to take over and talk to you about stencil works.
Thanks a lot, Sasha. Appreciate that introduction. That's very kind of you, and I'm pleased to be here. I'll share my screen now. Okay, thanks again, Sasha, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon, still afternoon in Reading and there in New York. My thanks to Type at Cooper for its invitation to contribute to the Lubalin lecture series. The idea for this talk, as captured in my subtitle, is to survey scenes of stencil work that could contribute to a history of the topic. I've been interested in stencil work for many years, and I feel that I now know many of its scenes. So for the next 60 minutes or so, by sharing some of these scenes with you, I'll try and draw out themes that run through stencil work, which may offer an argument for the topic's significance. And if the scenes don't quite amount to a fully representative history, perhaps they'll suggest the beginnings of one. So as I begin, I just want to confirm that nearly all the stencil work I'll be discussing is suggested by this image. It's work that involves 2 hands, a flat-ended brush charged with ink, and a plate from which a letter or some other character is cut out. The three together make stencil work. But before I get to my scenes, let me give you a little bit of background by way of introduction. As I've said, and as Sasha said too, I've been working on this topic for many years, about 25, but not continuously. But if I were to locate a point of departure, it would be this project called Typeform Dialogues, which I worked on in the 1990s with my then colleagues Catherine Dixon and the late Phil Baines. The project involved the design of a screen interface that surveyed the forms of types. And there are 140 types in the survey, which were selected by Catherine. One of these was Stencil, released by American type founders in 1937. Now, among my tasks was to write a profile of each type, and when it came to ATF Stencil, I drew a blank. Apart from a bit of information about its production, I was unable to discover much else about this typeface or about stencil letters in general. About the only source that came to hand was this article by R.S. Hutchings, published in 1958. And while its checklist of stencil types was commendable, its criteria for what constituted one were rather broad. And ultimately, Hutchings wasn't able to tell me what I most wanted to know, which was the longer story of stencil letters, their uses, and their sources. Well, from that early start, many more sources have been located, which I've assembled in this bibliography, which you can find online. It has about 100 entries across 6 languages and confirms that when you start researching a topic and can't find much about it, it usually means you just need to look harder. Anyway, it includes a few of my own studies, which attest to the scenes or episodes of stencil work I've been investigating. In doing this research, I've long benefited from the interest and support of my colleagues in the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication here at Reading, though I should single out 2 in particular, James Mosley and Fred Smyers, whose generosity and collaboration over the years have been very important to me. And I should also like to thank Michael Twyman, who early on encouraged me to collect the stencil artifacts I was beginning to encounter, rather than just record them. And this I've been able to do because our era exactly coincides with the emergence of online markets like eBay, which have been essential in locating artifacts that are highly dispersed and in some cases of little apparent value. And these I've assembled into a working collection which consists of stencil plates and tools, ephemera, and stenciled works. There have been opportunities to exhibit the artifacts, and they do indeed display quite nicely. And such events have been a chance to share research findings with an audience beyond academics and specialists. And in this instance, the exhibition also involved type designers in creating digital stencil typefaces, either original in design or that revived historical designs that I had documented. At Reading, I've used the collection for teaching and demonstration, hoping to encourage in students an expanded view of stencils in their many forms and uses. And in turn, I've benefited from their interest and critical questioning. So now, in the following scenes, I'd like to do something similar, that is to say, suggest an expanded view of stencil work for its own interest, and I hope your enjoyment, but also to point to key historical markers and demonstrate some of its themes. So my first scene is about origins, and for anyone who's a researcher, often origins are of great interest. So under the heading of incunabula, I start with these 3 examples that span a period of time from the late Roman Empire to 17th century France by way of late medieval Bavaria. The examples to the left and in the middle are what might be called cut work, while the inscription on the right is the only one of the 3 that's actually stenciled. But they share a common feature in that it's the ground around the letter that's been cut out rather than the letters themselves. And in this way, the conventional forms of the letters were kept intact and not broken, so to say. So far, the earliest known individual stencil letters are found in the 16th century manuscript made by the Nuremberg writing master Johann Neudorfer. In it, he constructed Roman inscriptional capitals with a pen, ink, and wash on every second page. And examples of these you can see at the left and in the middle. On the page following each drawn letter, he stenciled the same letter in black, which you can see on the right. And if we look closely at the stenciled version of the F, with a bit of digital manipulation, it's possible to discern the breaks in the letter formed by the bridges of the stencil. Now, these breaks clearly were not wanted, and so they were filled in with an ink wash. Turning to Spain around 1600, here we have a small cutwork prayer book that incorporates purposely designed cutout letters in several styles, backed by silk to better show them off. In these images, we can see capital and small letters. And in these details, a rotunda design, both plain and with a midline strike through, as well as a few italic and Hebrew letters. All of these, I would argue, are stencil letters as we now think of them, even if their cutout forms were not meant to be used for stenciling. So I'll now turn to three successive scenes in three countries in an attempt to suggest national tendencies, as I do think the story of stencil work warrants this. Since all the evidence suggests that the story gets going in France, that's where I'm going to start. And the scene opens impressively enough with this use of stencils to produce very large liturgical choir books. Unfortunately, we still know very little about how such work developed out of the antecedents I just showed. In any case, these books were large because members of the clergy gathered around them to perform the plain chant. They were needed in only a single copy, in part because their liturgical content was specific to a particular church or religious organization. They were also large because the assembled clergy might need to read them at a distance and in low light. And for this, using stencils made sense. The lengthy plain chant texts and notation, which are the stenciled parts of these books, could be made large and dense and very legible, while at the same time the letters could show off the latest Roman styles captured in expert form by the stencils. In each of these examples, the breaks in the letters have all been carefully filled in by hand with ink, as the detail shows, and this was common practice in most early examples. And here I should add that while such stencil work does appear to get started in France, over the course of the 18th century, it spread throughout Catholic Western Europe, including to present-day Belgium, southern Germany, parts of Switzerland, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and even Mexico. Back in France, stencils were also used by some of the most skilled writing masters, including Jean-Pierre Rousselet, who began his career in Paris in the late 17th century and was still active there in the 1730s. Here's a very fine prayer book he made in 1736 for a Carmelite convent in Bordeaux, kindly brought to my attention by Ewan Clayton. It seems to show Rousselet adopting stencils in part as a labor-saving measure, since they are used for the main text that runs across some 70 pages of this book. And if we look closely at the design of the letters, what's notable is that the stenciled letters in the text are different and distinct from the letters of the titles, headings, and initials, which are hand-drawn. This may suggest that the stencil letters used by Rousselet were not designed by him, though clearly he approved of them. My suspicion is that they were supplied to him by an engraver or stencil maker in Paris, since they conform to a general style of stencil letter that one finds in Paris throughout much of the 18th century. Stenciling was also taken seriously by individuals concerned with scientific matters. Thus, at the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris, at exactly the time early stencil books begin to appear in the second half of the 17th century, we find the Dutch natural philosopher Christian Huygens testing a new method of printing that was in effect stencil duplicating. Huygens was seeking an efficient way to make copies of his own handwriting and diagrams. And here's a surviving document in the middle that he made to prove that his method worked alongside, on the right, the oldest surviving metal stencil I'm aware of. Others at the Academy in Paris were also concerned with stenciling, and in particular with the composition of texts of the kind needed in large liturgical books. And so a rather intelligent stenciling method and associated equipment was devised in the 1690s, which you see here. It enabled a stenciler to mark out texts whose letters were perfectly aligned and consistently spaced and emulated conventional letters. And this was done by forming composite letters, which is to say by stenciling them in two joining parts where necessary. The stencils look like this on the left, and as you can see on the right, the stenciled letters have no breaks. On the left of the plate is a rectangular opening that allows the previously stenciled letter to be seen through the plate so that the one being stenciled could be placed the correct distance away. The configuration of the stencil on the left of this group is one of the few partial pieces of evidence we have that suggests that stencil work in France was actually done in this intelligent way. In general, though, such a method required an integration of stencils and other equipment that was probably impractical in most circumstances. And instead, I suspect that stencil plates were more commonly designed such that their use did not require additional customized equipment. And two examples of these kind of stencils I show here on the right. They have alignment triangles, angle cut corners, and a foot or handle folded out at the base, and in many instances, a generously sized plate made of brass. Also provided, but not always, was a different spacing system consisting of a dot following the letter, which indicated the position of the left stroke of the next letter to be stenciled, which was a workable system, but not always an infallible one. And here are a few examples of the elaborate kinds of stencil-made decoration found in French liturgical books in the 18th century. With these, I suspect that the breaks in stencil letters became more acceptable because the breaks helped unify letter forms and decoration. I also suspect that such decoration coincided with the development of decorated letters in a stencil idiom. To enable both, the technique of etching used to cut the plate became ambitious and rather sophisticated, which you can see in this group of stencils. And also in these, which were generally known as vignettes. Unfortunately, it's difficult to attribute individual stencils to known makers. This is because almost without exception, early French makers didn't mark their names on their stencils. Names have instead been located mostly in contemporary publications or notarial documents, but without providing any tangible links to artifacts. But one exception is Jean-Gabriel Barye. His work has survived mainly because it was collected by Benjamin Franklin in the 1780s while Franklin was residing in Paris. Franklin acquired a large number of stencils from Barye and preserved his specimen sheet, both of which tell us a lot about what Barye made. As you can see, Barye did mark his plates with his name and address, which was first on the Pont Notre Dame and later on the Pont Neuf. This practice appears to be unique to Barry, and indeed an unhelpful modesty amongst other French makers has continued more or less up to the present day. So it continues to be a challenge to identify who made what. But as we discover the names of more early stencil makers, we can begin filling in some details of their lives. In the case of Barry, for example, we can identify his place of work during the last years of his life. Here's his shop on the Pont Neuf, which he occupied in the 1780s. And a little bit closer up, but the image is beginning to break up. Anyway, this image was captured about 50 or 60 years after Barry occupied the shop, not long before it was demolished. But remarkably, stencils were still being made and sold there. Stenciled ephemera produced in France in the latter half of the 18th century and early decades of the 19th and include examples like these. On the left, a gift for the new year, then a bookplate, a pharmaceutical label, and a billhead. In the case of the New Year's gift, the stenciling was combined both with engraving and freehand coloring with a brush, while the pharmaceutical label combines stenciling with what I think is lithography. And here I add a stencil from this period used by a pharmacist in Dunkirk to produce small labels for packages of medicinal goods. If I were to point to one or two other highlights of the French scene, of which there are many, I would have to include what I've described elsewhere as the typical French stencil letter, which evolved out of earlier designs like those shown here, but which begin to take a definitive form in the middle decades of the 19th century, exemplified by stencils made first by the company Chevalier, which is an example, I think, on the right of this group. And then by its successor, Thévenot, whose stencils you see here. Thévenot has been credited with achieving this definitive form, but in fact, it seems like it was Chevalier that did so. And before leaving the French scene, I wanted to show one example of the other kind of stencil work for which France is known, but which is not really part of my topic. This is pochoir, the making of stencil designs and images with the aid of stencils. While pochoir is typically associated with fashion illustrations or books for bibliophiles, it was also used for producing portfolios, such as this one, made up of many plates showing schemes of decoration for commercial and entertainment interiors. And in a nicely self-referential way, the portfolio served as a sales catalog for the full-scale stencils one could purchase to execute these schemes. Okay, turning to Britain, the scene is different and gets started later. In some quarters, one finds a genuine hostility to stenciling, as confirmed by this petition lodged by the Painter Stainers Company of London. It presents grievances against foreigners and others whose use of stenciling was a false and deceitful work destructive to the art of painting, being a great hinderer of ingenuity and a cherisher of idleness and laziness in all beginners in the said art. The company's proposed remedy was that all painters, free and foreign, be prohibited from using the deceitful work of stenciling. Sorry, my notes have just disappeared. See if I can bring them back. Nope. Okay, I'll freeform it a little bit. There is early examples of stencils in Britain, such as this set that has come to be known fairly recently. I think it dates from the 1760s or 1770s. And although there's no maker's name associated with it or on it, I believe it might be connected with the London engravers and caricaturist Matthew Darley and his wife Mary Darley, who were at this time advertising stencils for ladies for marking fabrics and handbags and other such things. Here's one set of stencils from the outfit, made up of 3 registering plates, which could be used sequentially to create the polychromatic design on the left. Given variable attitudes towards Catholicism in post-Reformation Britain, there was apparently little stenciling of Catholic liturgical books there in the 17th and 18th centuries. Here, however, is one exception, a litany of 1775, probably made in Britain and almost uniquely presented in the vernacular rather than in Latin. If it was made in Britain, it offers rare evidence of stencil alphabet and numeral sets in use there at this time. The letter forms are not as sophisticated and well resolved as those found in France and may suggest homegrown production. Other early examples include visiting cards, such as these in the British Museum, which could also be used as book plates. They date to the 1770s and 1780s. In style, they're similar to engraved cards, which they appear to emulate. Apart from its novelty, presumably the ability to produce copies oneself as and when they were needed was one of stenciling's attractions, along with savings on the cost of printing. Here I add a stencil that was used for cards like this to illustrate what one would have looked like. Surprisingly, a review of several hundred trade cards of London engravers active in the second half of the 18th century turns up exactly 0 reference to stencils, so there is a suggestion that there was only a modest uptake of stenciling at this time. It's possible it was stencil work of this kind was at first seen in Britain as a fashion brought over from France. As in France, British use of stencils in the early decades of the 19th century was commonly for generating commercial documents, such as billheads, and here are a few examples. As you can see, they would have been stenciled as needed and then engrossed. Close up, you can see a range of lettering styles in stencil form and what is the billhead of an actual stencil maker, who is here called a stain foil engraver. Stencil like this would have been used for such documents, in this case for a business in Carnarvon in Wales. Tellingly, this stencil came with a much more elaborate and refined engraved copperplate version of a later date, suggesting that Mr. Jones started in business using a stenciled billhead before upgrading to a stenciled one, to an engraved one. Other early uses in Britain include stencils specifically for making book plates and marks of ownership. In some instances, as here, these could become very elaborate, though it's not exactly clear why a stenciled version was wanted alongside an engraved one. This kind of work shows off the engraver's skill in stencil cutting, which appears to have been done with graving tools rather than by etching, though it's possible a combination of the 2 techniques was used. Here, however, etching was employed to cut out the complex and delicate forms from very thin brass, which you can see in this close-up of the Masonic iconography. Also noticeable is the brass frame used to support the stencil plate. This arrangement with the frame in front is typical of named stencils in Britain and is different from similar stencils in the USA, in which the frame was placed behind the plate. Much stencil cutting in Britain in the 19th century is characterized by superb precision, which may be explained by the fact that some stencils of the period were produced by mathematical instrument makers for use by architects, surveyors, and engineers in their drawings. One such company was Archbutt of Lambeth, which was established in 1795 and whose catalog is typical of those issued by such makers. And they all had a wonderful grasp of the stencil idiom, which you can see here on the cover. While inside, there was no shortage of inspiration when it came to stencil letters, numerals, decorated initials, and much else. And finally, if I were to describe the conventional stencil plate format in Britain, or at least the most common one, it would be like these, thus angle cut corners, but no folded foot and no alignment triangles cut into the sides. In the USA, the scene is again specific to the place. In opening the scene, I offer one of the earliest datable instances of stencil use in the USA, a furniture mark of the maker Michael Allison, who occupied this address in New York from 1808 to 1815. The mark is suggestive of links between the USA and Britain, since we find a circulating library label from Folkestone in Kent in very much the same style and from around the same time. And this instance may suggest that Americans initially sourced their stencils from British makers, or in this case, the British maker had emigrated to the US. In general, though, evidence so far found indicates that stenciling practices that transferred to North America appear to have come largely or wholly from Britain rather than from France. Other evidence of early stencil work in the USA is mainly in the form of newspaper advertisements. Here are several placed in the 1820s by makers in Charleston, Philadelphia, and Boston. Of them, Nathaniel Dearborn, an engraver who went on to become a printer, author, and publisher, is the only one who remains well known today. The ads provide helpful descriptions of the kinds of stencils they offered, which included personal name stencils, alphabet and numeral sets, and stencils for shipping. In the case of Danby of Philadelphia, his ad in a Liverpool newspaper at exactly the same date indicates that he supplied stencils in both locations. And you'll notice that Danby and Moss describe stencils as pierced plates. And while Dearborn used the word stencil, elsewhere he referred to perforated plates. So it seems as though the word stencil was perhaps not yet widely known at this time. Among early stencil documents in the USA, billheads are some of the earliest. Examples occur already in the 1820s, and here are a couple of examples from Philadelphia and Boston from the 1830s. Early stencils made in the USA are much more difficult to locate, though gradually some are coming to light. Among them are stencil alphabets made by Thomas Pittis, who emigrated from Britain together with his family around 1820. He eventually established an engraving business in New York in the 1840s. And because he helpfully stamped his name and business address onto his stencils, and because the dates of his addresses can be determined from business directories, these examples can be roughly dated in turn. And as you can see, his stencils follow typographic styles at the time, including fat face and antique. Another rougher kind of early work is the vernacular name stencil. These were used for marking flour or grain sacks, for freight, or other possessions, and possibly they were used for display, since some examples have what appear to be nail or tack holes in them for mounting on a wall or maybe onto a wagon. One of the most characteristic features of the US scene is the production and use of stencil cutting tools. In the middle and to the right are chisels and large dies, which are typically used by stencil businesses. On the left is another kind of die, in this case, very small ones. These were advertised and sold to private individuals who were encouraged to take up stencil cutting as a form of self-employment. Such dies were sold in outfits like this one, along with other necessary tools and materials, plus a license, an order book, and copies of the notice you see on the right, which could be posted anywhere a canvassing stencil cutter might seek out customers. And with the dies, a stencil cutter could make small name stencils like these, which were quite popular for 2 or 3 decades, including among soldiers of the American Civil War. And here, again, in contrast to British examples, the frame around which the stencil is folded is behind the plate. Selling stencil tools was part of the entrepreneurial energy of the US scene, and for many like Silas Metcalf Spencer, a start in stencil work later expanded into a business of considerable size, supplying all kinds of marking equipment, especially rubber stamps. And as you can see on the cover of this Spencer catalog, the word stencil often remained prominent in the company name long after their relative contribution to the business had declined. The scene is also populated by stencil inventions, of which these are just 2. Some might seem clever, like the one on the right, but could be difficult to use, while apparently helpful add-ons like the shield on the left could be more trouble than their apparent worth, although the Tarbox stenciled disc still sold well, judging by the large numbers that survive. But some inventions were very useful to the point of being nearly perfect in concept and in practice. And Reese's adjustable stencil plates is one such invention and is indeed a rare instance of a device patented 150 years ago that is still being made and sold today in exactly the same form by the original manufacturer. Probably the most common form of stencil in the USA was the standard shipping stencil, in which the number in the center identified the sender of the freight. There were also many areas of industry and agriculture that required the stenciling of brands onto barrels, crates, and sacks, in which were shipped products such as flour, grain, beer, and spirits, apples, tobacco, cheese, and much else. And for a time, these brands in stencil form became the image of companies and products, as some advertising ephemera attests. And given the impulse in the USA to mechanical invention, and the notion that such devices could improve stencil work, it's maybe not surprising that the mechanical composition and cutting of stencils was achieved there. The stencil machine is another 19th century stencil invention that is still manufactured today in more or less the same form. And to draw this scene to a close, here for comparison is the typical stencil plate format in the USA, shown on the right. It has a folded foot, but no alignment triangles or angle cut corners. But this format appears to have evolved from the example on the left, whose 4 angle cut corners suggest that the earliest stencils in the USA were more similar to their British and French forebears. Okay, so this next scene might strike you as possibly a bit dry, so I'll try and keep it brief, but it's a scene in the loosest sense that I found hugely interesting, partly because it speaks to one of the most basic difficulties a researcher can run into, which is what exactly is the name of the thing that I'm looking for? Today, many languages have all-purpose terms for stencil, as in French, German, and English, which I show here, and they serve as nouns, verbs, and modifiers of various kinds. Now, this keeps things simple, but simple comes at the expense of historical access, because in the case of pochoir and schablone, these are 19th century terms. If you look at older sources, you won't find them there. In a similar way, early uses of stencil in English generally refer to painting and decorating, and possibly to playing card manufacture, but less often or not at all to the kind of stencil work I've been after. But as I now understand, this was precisely the clue. Because what I was looking for was this, and the terms I eventually found did indeed describe this. So to start with French, the key term is caractère. It's a slightly complicated term because it generally refers not only to a character, as in English, but also to its physical manifestation. And caractère can refer to different kinds of objects, so modifiers are involved too, like en cuivre and à jour. When en cuivre is added, it generally implies a stencil, since stencils were almost always made of cuivre, that is to say, brass. À jour, which means cut out, literally of daylight, is unequivocal. It always means a stencil or at least a cutout letter. The earliest date I have for caractère à jour is 1730, and it continues in use today in some specialist contexts. Here are other descriptors for the stencil, including thin plates of cutout brass and brass letters for writing. The latter indicating that stenciling was sometimes thought of as writing rather than printing, though elsewhere and more often it was referred to as printing, and that stencil letters imitated printing types. Vignette usually referred to stencils with figurative designs as opposed to letters or numerals for which caractère was used. There are also terms for the stencil maker, who was indeed sometimes a maker, faiseur, and at other times an engraver. And finally, a rare description of the stenciller, which speaks clearly to the hybrid or in-between nature of stencil work by describing a printer copyist who uses movable caractère and vignettes. In German, something similar happens. Here, the key term is Blech, roughly sheet metal. It's the base term on which is built compound nouns, as in these terms for the stencil plate, Blechbuchstaben and Kupferblechplatten, and these for the stencil cutter, Schneider, and their art, Schneiderkunst. And these for the stenciler and their art, literally the art of painting with sheet metal. And here are some additional phrases which clearly describe stencil work as writing, again, schreiben, rather than printing. In English, we find something similar again, but later in the 19th century and less expansively, which may suggest that stenciling with metal plates arrives later or is slower to generate specific terms. But before I show you these, here's the earliest term I've found in English that refers to metal letter stencils, and it's from 1747. It's been translated directly from caractère à jour, which may explain its kind of awkward vagueness. As I say, there are fewer there are fewer English terms. The main innovation is to invoke the stencil plate by forming a compound, thus stencil plate. However, in the first decades of the 19th century, the use of stencil was unstable, it seems, because the term was not well known, as I've already mentioned. And so again, other more common descriptors are also used, such as indeed pierced and perforated. And as I've already pointed out in the billhead earlier, there is an additional term, stain foil, which is actually a concise and accurate alternative, and maybe a genuinely new word, since stain refers to the water-based pigment commonly used for stencil work. But this term was only used for a short time in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and only in Britain, and then it disappeared. Latin terms can also be found, once again, on similar lines in some instances. Thus, in the second example shown here, we have laminas scripta, plate letters for writing, using the term laminas for plate, which is also found in descriptors for stencil making, and which additionally use two different verbs to carve and to engrave in sculptus and incidit, along with a reference to the metal, in this case, iadis, which typically means copper. Here are two terms for stenciling. The first is roughly self-explanatory, though in this instance, the metal referred to is brass, Aeneas. The second term is a bit less obvious. Presumably, its reference is to branches or arms of some kind, bracteo, perhaps in an attempt to evoke stencils or their visual effect. And finally, several occurrences in Italian and Portuguese, again, both from the 18th century. The casa in the second Portuguese example refers to the room in the former royal palace at Mafra, just outside Lisbon, where stencil books were made. Okay, enough. Now I'd like to show you literally some scenes. These open with this well-known image by Joost Amon of Der Briefmaler, who is clearly stenciling color onto prints. Such brushes and dishes for the color exactly match those found in French studios producing pochoir work in the 20th century. For the next scene, I'll just return to this engraving by Simonot, which I showed earlier, but now to have a closer look at two of the earliest known scenes of stencil work of the kind I'm discussing. On the right is possibly the only depiction of a stencil maker from before the 20th century, holding a stencil in a vise with a hammer. On the left, a stenciler is standing at his work. And from secular Paris, we travel to monastic Belém, where 4 Hieronymite monks were apparently needed to conduct the work of stenciling a liturgical book. The drawing comes from the title page of the book they're shown stenciling. The monk on the right may be holding an exemplar from which the stenciled book is being copied, or possibly instructions for how to do the work. And a closer look shows that such stenciling was in fact a combination of handwriting and stenciling, thus involving quills and other equipment of the scribe. And the letterboard behind the table to hold and organize the stencils is a valuable confirmation that such equipment was indeed used. Back in France, at the end of the 19th century, we find stencil work in the office where one could print posters oneself, and in the warehouse where stencils were used in exactly the way we imagine for marking crates, sacks, and barrels. Still in France, we shift now to the fragrant surroundings of the boudoir, where pochoir, in a classical mood, conveys the contemporary fashion for stenciling interiors. And from there to the streets of Paris, where urban painter-decorators are busy making street art innovations, later taken up with such enthusiasm by graffitiists in Britain and in many other parts of the world. In Germany and elsewhere in Europe, and later in the USA, stencils were also used for guiding embroidery. And so the stenciled design, such as a monogram or decorative border, was worked over with needle and thread rather than serving as a standalone decoration, as would have been the case using the 18th century English stenciling outfit I showed earlier. This scene is found on a box in which the stencils came for embroidery. And here in close-up is a woman doing the stenciling part of this work. Over in the USA, back in the 1870s, we see the name of a then famous soap, Sapolio, being stenciled also at night onto fences, as was apparently the practice at the time. The verses are by the American writer and poet Bret Harte, who was not afraid to turn his pen to doggerel in the service of commerce. Still in the USA, here's a rare scene of stencil cutting, co-opted, I believe, by the temperance movement. And finally, a more common warehouse scene showing workers following Marsh's two-step process of stencil work: cut the stencil, mark the shipment. Anyway, that's more or less all I have. Such scenes have been pretty hard to come by, so if anyone discovers any others, I'd be glad to know of them. I wanted to turn now to a more recently discovered scene, which I've explored with a collaborator, Pierre Panaferre. It's a French scene by and large, and while the title of Previously Unknown may be an exaggeration, it's certainly one that had disappeared almost entirely from view. This scene is of stenciled posters, notices, and advertisements. Here's an early example of a poster from the 1770s made by a stenciler who was also making stenciled liturgical books at the cathedral at Beauvais. The poster, notably, is similar in size to a typical stenciled liturgical book page. For some time, we had no visual reference to stenciled posters or notices put up outdoors on the walls of cities and towns, as was the practice in France in the first decades of the 19th century. But recently, several prints have been located that do show them. They're here in a small square format, but definitely stenciled. You can tell by their dash and dot frames, as well as by the stencil letters, which can just be discerned if we zoom in like this. Such stencils, stenciled notices, were known as affiches à la brosse, that is, of the brush, and were stenciled onto paper before being stuck up. They advertised things like offices for rent, situations for young men, or the sale of goods released by speculators from the Mont de Piété, which was a publicly administrated pawn brokerage. At first, such notices were untaxed because stenciling was not classified as printing. But eventually, the classification was changed and they were taxed just like other posters and notices printed on paper. So to avoid this conjunction of printing, paper, and tax, bill posters began stenciling notices and advertisements directly onto walls and fences. And that's what we see here on a plank fence around the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Zooming in, you can see the scale of the work and the light white or colored grounds laid down before the stenciling was done. Stenciling of this kind appears to inaugurate the practice of applying large-scale advertisements directly onto urban surfaces, whether by stenciling or painting or some combination of the two. By this time, they were called affiches peintes and later affiches au ponceau, a term that invokes stenciling by reference to pouncing. The practice appears to have been most common in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, though evidence of it apparently survives only in contemporary photographs and in accounts published in newspapers, legal journals, and commercial directories. I'll close the scene with the street view by Charles Marvy, taken while he was working as a photographer for the city of Paris. On the wall here are 3 stenciled advertisements alongside several paper ones. And here, about as close as we can get in this reproduction, it's possible to sense the effect of the stenciling on the masonry surface, as well as the content of the illustration, which is of a man who has hooked a pair of trousers on his fishing line. So with that image in our minds, I'll now turn to my final scene and circle back to where I started, type and typefaces. Soon after I began research on stencil work, my interest in stencil typefaces waned as I turned my attention to the artifacts and activities of actual stenciling. Behind this change was the thought that a stencil typeface is a kind of contradiction, which is summed up by this image of ATF stencil cast as metal type. The contradiction is a technical one in which one technology, movable metal type, pointlessly embodies the technical residue of another, the breaks of stencil letters. So at one level, any stencil typeface is a confounding exercise. The more so if we remember that over the centuries, stencil letters were intended to imitate printing types, not the other way around, and that much time and ingenuity was spent on hiding their breaks or filling them in. Now, I realize this may be a sort of fundamentalist way of looking at things, but it does raise the question of whether type founders were put off by similar thoughts. This may be why typefaces based on typical stencil letters were rather late in arriving, not until the 1930s, long after the explosion of all kinds of typeface styles in the 19th century, which was a time, ironically, when stencil letters were very common. So in 2013, I was asked by iMagazine to write an article about stencil typefaces. And as I turned my attention back to the topic, one of the first things I wanted to learn more about was one typeface that was an exception to this late arrival theory. That typeface is called Stencil Gothic, which I saw in Ray Nash's chapter in Nicolette Gray's 1976 book, 19th Century Ornamented Typefaces. Stencil Gothic was released by McKellar Smiths and Jordan in 1885, and here's how it appears in their specimen book of that year. And here it is in a little bit more detail. I noticed that the showing included a note that the typeface was patented and registered, and so I turned to US Patent Office records to see if I could track it down. And after quite a bit of searching, I did finally locate it amongst the design patents. The patent's text is short, though it does give the patentee's name, John West, who is the son of the better-known Scottish-American punch cutter James West. And it also confirms a date of 1885. West's stated design aim was to show the appearance of stencil work. When I was writing the article, I cited this as the first purposely designed stencil typeface and gave the patent number, hoping that somebody might take notice. And indeed they did. Two typeface designers from Vienna, Johannes Lang and Elmar Stefan, who made this convincing digital revival. And so I'm glad the putatively first stencil typeface is back in digital circulation. While I'm on this tangent, I thought I'd interject a more recent discovery which presents its own case for earliest. It's an innocuous advertising cover for SM Spencer, maker of the stencil dies I showed earlier. Before moving to Boston in 1872, Spencer's company was located in Vermont. And if you have a look in the corner, you can see several texts that appear to be composed in printing types, which are stencil in effect. So are these the first stencil types? My hunch is that they were conventional metal types, each letter of which was altered with gravers and files. And if so, then perhaps these are the earliest known stencil effect printing types, but not the first to be purposely designed that way from the outset. Anyway, here now is the article commissioned by I took R.S. Hutchings as a point of departure, so a survey would be the aim, after I discussed some historical aspects of stencil letters and types by way of introduction. In the survey, I limited myself to digital fonts released after about 1990, so the article could at once review recent designs and at the same time link them to certain areas of my research. The fonts were gathered into thematic groups. So to start with, I chose fonts whose forms could be connected to stencil tools and stencil making techniques. A second group featured fonts that reference the effects or contexts of stenciling. And so on, up to 8 groups whose fonts exemplified 8 themes, which you can see here. By the time the article was done, I had sifted through hundreds of fonts to get to grips with their expanse, and I must say I was a bit overwhelmed. But in doing the sifting, I felt I had managed to arrive at a reasonable representation of the variety of stencil font creation during this period. And from the sifting, I also got a kind of message, which was that I should forget about the apparent technical contradiction of stencil types and instead treat the digital sphere simply as a medium for stencil letters, however they ended up being used. And when I did this, I could then see that the period I was surveying was perhaps the most inventive that there's been in the longer history of stencil work, at least as far as letter forms are concerned. Okay, so now some themes. And here are a few, which I hope you'll recognize by way of the evidence of my scenes. I realized while assembling this talk that I could have approached it in the opposite way by setting out themes and then populating them with evidence. And maybe that would have been better. But I've had this notion that in my research, I've wanted the evidence to come first and from it let themes emerge. This mostly unexplored topic has seemed to need that, though I do accept that synthesis into themes is also needed. Uh, in any case, my aim has been and continues to be a representation of stencil work across time, place, and context so that stencil work can be celebrated as much for its own attractive scenes as for its place in a wider field of technology, culture, and ideas. To end, I wanted to share with you an article about stenciled letter forms I encountered a few years ago, written by Robert Harling under his pen name Nicholas Drew, and kindly brought to my attention by Paul Shaw. It predates the article by R.S. Hutchings by some 18 years, and may be the earliest such survey in English. Harling wrote it after completing work on the typeface T-chest for Stevenson Blake, and it's notable for recommending the revival of authentic historical forms, even in preference to inventing new ones like Futura Black, Braggadocio, and the rest. Harling's recommendation may be connected to this quotation from the article. He writes, the history of stencils is fairly well documented. The history of stenciled letter forms, on the other hand, is singularly bleak. There is but scant reference to their use and no trace of their origins in the British Museum, the London Library, the Victorian Albert Museum, or the St. Bride's Library. Typographical historians and authorities can offer little help in the matter. But as you can see, the quotation doesn't quite end there. Instead, Harling continues, to engage in a lifetime's endeavor to trace the history of stencil letter forms would seem to be the perfect pastime for some typographical historian with an adequate private income and an expectation of life of some 40-odd years. Well, I can now disagree with Harling that the history of stencil letter forms is singularly bleak. Nearly 85 years later, I think it's brighter, but I would agree that it's been the perfect pastime, which hasn't quite required a private income, though at times it's felt that way. And if one were to change life to research career, then tempting fate, perhaps I have time yet in an allotted span of 40-odd years. I hope you've enjoyed a few scenes from the first 25. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, I am always astounded and kind of blown away by the um, how complex and how intricate the history of stencil is. I think like it's one of those areas where it feels like very simple, very easy to understand. I think because it's such a part of commercial or at least like the visual connections to most folks are kind of to its commercial applications. I think like the military tends to be a very common one. I think prior to that, like the shipping crates, I think the between the shipping crates and military, people have a very strong idea of what stencils mean. And then of course, kind of in the typographic landscape, the stencil as a typeface, which you very eloquently kind of ended on. But I think it's always amazing to see how broad that space is and how interesting the material is. So, and Hartling's quote about we appreciate that you took up the task of unpacking this. It certainly opened my eyes to a lot of this research and material. We'll take some questions from folks. And if you can, please direct them to the Q&A window. And we'll take a few. I also wanted to maybe ask or highlight this as we wait for a couple more questions to come in. I wanted to ask Eric if this is fair to categorize it this way or kind of this is just processing the talk in a way like I'm struck by this idea of like the billheads and like the essentially you can imagine like the birth of billheads as a device, as a tool of commercial communication, certainly kind of an important bureaucratic layer of things. But you can imagine prior to the creation and the use of billheads, you could simply just write the letter. You could
Yeah.
function, in a commercial space without, let's say, like a pre-branded kind of heading. It's simply just a letter with that stuff. But in a way, I appreciate the fact that you could customize these now, and I think like the stencil is kind of a perfect way to save on the cost of having them engraved or printed. You could essentially bring back the printing needs in-house, so to speak, by investing in some kind of stencil. And so it seems like there's a very strong relationship between the expansive nature of stencils and how commercial activities start to really quickly kind of rise throughout the 18th, 19th century. So is that fair to say that there's like a very strong driving force between the need for commercial or the driving force of expanded commerce and the stencils? Is that sort of pulling stencils and activating stencils?
Yeah, I think those are very good points. I think certainly, say early traders, early people in business, if they were small traders, may simply not have had the resources to access or to commission printed works, printed billheads, much less engraved ones. And so stenciling gave you a sort of inexpensive way to produce billheads that had the look of or emulated to some extent in an orderly way, either printing, and this I mean typographical printing or engraving. And so perhaps people in trade, as I say, that were maybe small traders and didn't really have resources could sort of emulate the authority of printed documents. Stenciling is often doing that. It's a when it is an emulative mode, let's call it. It is partly to access that authority of more established forms of printing, and I think that's partly why people are attracted to it. And then, as you also said, and this is true, you see this in actually in fewer advertisements than you'd think, and mainly in the United States. Um, each man or each person their own printer. And so stencils were uh, advertised as a way, yeah, basically to do your own printing. So you could generate billheads as often as you needed them or when you needed them. And you didn't have to go to a printer or an engraver to print them for you.
Mhm. I'm gonna catch a few questions like that I see in chat, just so we don't lose them. And they're not meant to be kind of in order. Usually, I try to kind of sequence them, but I think all the questions are super interesting. So there's a very interesting question I hadn't thought about. Has anyone done a comprehensive study of Arabic or Hebrew stencil use? Would you say that certain alphabets are more conducive to stencil letters than others?
I think I don't know if some are more conducive to others just in formal terms. I mean, you can introduce breaks to pretty much any letter form. Uh, but the students here at Reading have told me that certain non-Latin scripts, in many cases, are not amenable to a stencil treatment simply because the way in which the breaks are imposed actually seems to kind of undermine or compromise the sense or the legibility of the letter form, and so in some cases that kind of thing has been done, but maybe is not entirely sensitive to the meaning of the script. The same is true in Chinese, but there again, students here in the department have shown me examples where both a kind of intelligent intervention has been made and where a sort of crude and, if I could put it this way, kind of unintelligent intervention has been made. Unintelligent in the sense that it's not sensitive to the character on which the breaks are being imposed. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone's done a study of that. There was one typeface in the I article, which I think was a Devanagari, which was in stencil form and had been created by somebody in India. So aware of those issues.
Mhm. There's a few questions I think that came through in terms of I see one from Susan Smith. When purchasing stencils on brass or wood rather than copper, silver, or gold, was the only reason cost? Did consumer know the durability difference? And there's another question that came in, I think, a little earlier in terms of the um, stencils that were made through an etching process and whether that would be quite expensive for the consumer, so to speak, to acquire something that. So maybe like in terms of cost materiality, if you could talk a little bit about that, like whether etching would be a very expensive.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, in the 18th century, what the true cost of a stencil was, or sets of stencils were. Certainly, Franklin preserved the invoice from Barry, and so the cost is known. They weren't cheap, but at the same time, stencil makers were advertising or trying to encourage a general consumership of stencil purchasing. So they must not have been too terribly expensive. As far as materials are concerned, I think as the 19th century went on, you see more and more stencils made out of zinc, which must have been a less expensive metal and often was termed by the manufacturers as not as high quality as, say, certain brass, which I guess we should probably call copper alloy, because then it gives us a spectrum of stencils that were had more copper in the alloy, and then the stencils that had less, which we generally think of as brass instead. And there were cost differentials, and so you could yeah, make a choice as to which metal you wanted, and therefore notionally in terms of its durability, or possibly in terms of its quality of cutting. Um, but sometimes, you would look at these zinc stencils, they were all manufactured by die stamping and they were just as good as the brass ones. So, the reason for choosing one or the other is not always entirely clear.
Mhm. And there's always the which I imagine like just in terms of timelines, I think like by the 19th century you could buy the dyes and kind of start making your own, which means you could experiment with various different surfaces, and if a stencil is no longer usable, you could fix it, you could change it, you could stamp. I mean the dyes would essentially allow you to customize rather than essentially kind of create. You would do the whole letter, you would kind of, or words, I think like that was always the intent, just to not make a standalone letter stencil. I think it was always kind of like the whole phrase, because why waste time? making things, but I suppose you could also stamp them and sell individual pieces too.
Yeah, that actually is a very important underlying theme, which is when our alphabet and numeral sets used. That is to say, you compose them letter by letter or number numeral by numeral, or when is a stencil in which I guess you could say matter is set out in its totality, like on a billhead, so that you really just need one stencil to do all that work. And there's some interesting sort of instances where you look at the work letter by letter and you think, well, this is pretty intense to do these, say, texts in small letters, letter by letter. But really, there was no other way to do it because you wouldn't really make that as a single stencil, simply because you wanted to compose words and texts. And for that, you need something that's akin to movable metal type, where you have individual units then you can compose as you need to.
Mhm. There's a question that echoed some of the thoughts I was having. Wanted to maybe bring this up, so we're talking about a little bit more of the techno part. I mean, I guess Stencil technically are, very technically driven. But Craig Eliason asked on your research methods for the early examples that were filled in. How do you locate, recognize them? Is it a matter of looking very closely for evidence of touch-ups? In the breaks, or do you start to recognize the style of letters that are likely to be stenciled, which again also points to that distinction between earlier stencils where in many cases the bridges were kind of painted over, or the stencil was constructed in such a way where you could reconstitute the letter and make it essentially invisible.
Yeah.
How do you identify?
Yeah, it's a really good question that Craig asks. It's all of those things, but I think it's the more you look at this work, the more you can just quickly recognize it, and it really has to do with just simply the way the letters are composed on the sheet of vellum or paper. There's a certain mechanical irregularity to composing letters letter by letter with stencil plates. Um, I mean, you could say that maybe there's something similar that if you try to do the same thing with metal type and just composed it letter by letter with your hands, when you see the effect of that, it immediately indicates stenciling. And it's because the letters are very regular, but they're shifted or angled slightly, or the baseline's not quite straight, or the way that they're spaced is kind of mechanically irregular, you could say. And after you've looked at quite a bit of this work, that jumps right out at you. Uh, that said, there's still, I think, quite a lot of instances where stencil work is being misidentified or not identified at all. This is less the case now because I think archivists and librarians are becoming more aware of it, and that this work, say in France, was fairly widespread, or there's quite a bit of it that survives, and are making correct identifications now and cataloging accordingly. But because these works often look like manuscripts, then they get cataloged as manuscripts, and so the assumption is that the letter forms and plain chant notation is also made with basically with a pen, and that's not the case. These are hybrid documents. So yeah, that subtlety is being pulled out. There is indeed the evidence of the style of the letter form too, which Craig makes reference to. And yes, that's taken longer. The more I look at work, the more I can begin to see styles of stencil letters during periods of time, and those might be attributed to the place, but maybe to individual makers who were particularly prolific at that point in time. So styles are beginning also to emerge as more and more work is recorded and discovered.
Mhm. I think also like probably it's harder to do that probably with 19th or 20th century, but like the further back in history you go, the source material kind of if it's a liturgical text, like the context of the use of letter form could indicate whether it was more likely to be stenciled, right? Because of what I love with the title of the exhibition that you and Fred put together, between writing and type, like as a very apt I think description. Like it would be thinking of stencils when they're used, like when writing maybe isn't as efficient. So stencil kind of fits that goal, or type is maybe too expensive, or you're producing one, you wouldn't set the press for one copy. You would obviously make an addition. So, writing is too slow or too cumbersome, and printing doesn't make sense. So it kind of really fits. So if you find objects that really resonate with that kind of limitation, stencils feel so perfectly kind of filling in that gap.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You can begin to identify the context in which they're going to be most appropriate in terms of labor, but also in terms of the access to expert form. It's very difficult to draw a good-looking Roman letter with a pen, um, and doing it with a stencil made by an expert engraver, allows you to produce a really expert-looking Roman letter form, or others as well. And so, that is another instance when people might be attracted to that kind of work. And yes, making one-offs or making things yourself. And then basically the idea of marking, which is when you're essentially sort of transferring letters and text and so on and graphic marks onto irregular surfaces. That's another instance where, for a time, stenciling was exactly a good way to do that. We have other methods for marking irregular surfaces now, but at the time, stenciling again was exactly right for that. You wouldn't want to paint those, and you might not want to put on a paper label, so stencils were perfect.
There's a question earlier that came in from Susan about like the ink being applied or with I guess, like, the question I'm paraphrasing is a little bit like how the ink is actually applied through a stencil, because it's not a typical brush, because I think the idea is that you want kind of perpendicular pressure coming through rather than just painting through the surface, right? I think it's like something where the paint needs to push through. So they would be very specific brushes made for this, right?
Yeah, I think the point that Susan raises is really super interesting to stencil work for all kinds of reasons. Yes, as far as the brush is concerned, it was cut across perpendicular to the direction of the bristles. It was partly so it could hold more ink, but indeed it was because often you're using the brush in a vertical tamping kind of technique. But there are different schools of thought. Some are tampers, some are strokers.
Mhm.
And some stencils you need to do a bit of stroking to get the brush into the small parts of the stencil, which sometimes tamping doesn't do. The other key, absolutely, and this is something that Dwiggins refers to, is that the viscosity of the ink has to be exactly right, and that takes a little bit of practice, um, especially if it's a really water-based. I mean, all of these are water-based inks. Some come in a kind of cake-like form that you then mix with water, and getting the viscosity of that exactly right is super important, because too thick, it won't stencil the whole design. Too thin, it'll run under the plate. And so it has to be right in the middle. There are other kinds of ink which you find in France, which are more sort of cream or mousse-like, and you don't have to deal with water at all. And that gives you this really incredible black velvety surface. And if you look at some of these early liturgical books, they seem to have this kind of ink already back in the 17th century, because the letters are very black and they sit right beautifully on the surface of the vellum or the parchment, which, yeah, that kind of watery ink never does. So you need a different kind of ink that adheres to that smooth surface but stays there also. So again, I think the French were really quite advanced in having, yeah, different kinds of inks also available to them. And the crucial thing is that this is water-based in all cases, so that you can wash your stencils and your brush very easily, and you don't need solvents like you would with oil-based inks. It's so the cleanup and the working is very easy. And then again, the other reason for water-based is that as soon as you stencil, if it's the right viscosity, you take the stencil away, and by the time you bring the next one on top of it, it's likely that the ink is dry.
Mhm.
Whereas if that was an oil-based, you'd be waiting until the next day to do the next letter. So water-based ink was really the most common.
Mhm. Um, just being mindful of everyone's time. We probably will close here. I know there's several more questions, but folks, if you wanted to connect with Eric, you can reach out and ask some of these questions. But I think like the most interesting part for me, at least, hopefully our audience, our attendees watching this video and or this talk and then eventually the video or intrigued enough to maybe pursue thinking about stencils as an art form, as a quite complicated technical process. Some of the pieces that are behind you showing kind of the way it's made. It's quite remarkable how we talk about like the punch cutting, how intricate and complicated this as an art form, certainly, and stencils are not that far off from that. So hopefully folks are intrigued and now have a little bit of an eye for coming across documents and being able to spot what is indeed a stencil, and then thinking about the broader applications of the stencil as a look as it transfers into the typographic space where typefaces are made to imitate the typefaces, imitating stencil, even though the function is not really that crucial. Now you have a look and aesthetic and kind of a postmodern way. So it's and then there's a mention in the questions about Jasper Johns, and you have, of course, like people like Corbusier who are using stencils, and so would Charles Eames would fall to me into that category, being fond of these very mechanical tools and adding them into the work. So, but also thinking about where letter forms exist that aren't handwritten versus printed, and there's a very wide area there that I think is super interesting. So hopefully folks are thinking about this now after watching your talk.
Yeah, there's a whole other talk which you and I have talked about, which is stencils and paintings. And you've named Jasper Johns, yes, a frequent user of stencils. Robert Indiana is the other American painter who did quite a lot of work in this area. And of course, there's Europeans and Le Corbusier in his architectural drawings. Yeah, so a rich area also for research over in that direction.
Yeah, famously credited as the designer of the Letraset, the charrette typeface, which is but very much a vernacular store-bought thing. But it's kind of interesting that he gets the credit for something he didn't really fully establish. But and then Letraset, of course, as dry transfer lettering as a genre that really feels like a very much kind of that continuation of a stencil idea. So
Yeah,
super.
you're quite right. Dry transfer lettering and stenciling have a real close relationship. There's yeah, conceptually, there's a strong relationship between those two things.
Yeah, certainly even in the making of the cutting edge first kits for and the screen printing process, there's quite a bit of a shift there. But we can keep talking about this for forever. Hopefully there'll be a part two. We'll keep thinking about how to bring this idea and continue this conversation. Thank you so much for everyone watching. Eric, a million thanks for your insight and your knowledge and wonderful slides and also for doing this incredible research. I think it's incredibly valuable, and we thank you for that, and thank you for coming here and sharing this with us. So.
Well, thanks for those kind words, Sasha. Yeah, it's I really enjoy sharing all this yeah, research with everybody. So I hope it was of interest, and it was just a pleasure to join your series.
We really appreciate it. So folks, catch the recording. It's going to be available in a week. You can catch this on YouTube if you wanted to catch any of the slides you might have missed. Eric I'm sure we'll have you again on the series at some point soon enough. And then for the folks, we have 2 more lectures coming up before the year is over. Have a great week. I know it's going to be, tomorrow's a big day here in the States. I think the world is watching, so we're all kind of in the tense moment, but hopefully things are going to be okay, and we can all kind of move on but yeah, I know there's a lot of distractions, but be well, everyone. And we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone.